There's an old story about Saint Francis of Assisi who lived in the 12th century AD. Like many in his day, Francis was especially grossed out by the common sight of lepers. One day, as Francis was riding his horse on a lonely country road, he spotted a leper walking in his direction. Francis could plainly see the poor man was terribly disfigured. The disease had eaten away at parts of his face and hands. Francis' first instinct was to turn around, or at least move quickly to the side of the road to avoid being near this revolting sight. But Francis knew of Jesus' call to love all people, even the most unlovely. And so he dismounted from his horse, and, though the leper's appearance nauseated Francis, he walked over to the leper, embraced, and kissed him. The leper held out his hand, and Francis gave him a coin. When Francis remounted his horse, he looked but saw no leper. The man had vanished. Francis became convinced that this leper was actually Jesus himself, incognito. I don't know if that story is true, but just the thought of Jesus showing up incognito sends shivers up my spine. Yet, in some Old Testament stories, we witness God himself making disguised appearances. And we know the risen Jesus appeared incognito to a couple of disciples on the road to Emmaus. See Luke 24. Might Jesus do the same thing with you and me? Welcome to Part 8 in this video small group teaching series, God the Son. Today's lesson is called God's Big Secret. In Chapter 8 of my book, God the Son, we examine some passages in the Old Testament in which Yahweh slowly reveals his identity to people who assume, at first, he's someone else. In the New Testament Gospels, God the Son slowly reveals his true identity as Yahweh to his disciples. In this lesson, we're going to look at some fascinating passages in John that teach us about Jesus' strategic reveal and what those texts mean for us who seek to know him more deeply and personally. But first, please turn off the video and take about 10 minutes to discuss your homework assignment with your group. Hope you had a good discussion with your group. Now, let's jump into our study. I have a true or false question for you. True or false, Jesus never called himself God. Raise your hand if you think that statement is true. He never called himself God. Take a quick count in your group. Okay, now, how many think the statement is false? He did call himself God. Raise your hand. Okay, now, how many think it's a trick question? What's the answer? Well, you might be surprised to hear me say all three answers could be correct depending on how you think I meant the statement. It's not a trick question, but it is a tricky question. On the one hand, in the strict sense, Jesus never said the words, "I am God." So it's technically true that he never called himself by the title God. On the other hand, Jesus did indeed equate himself with God by claiming that God is his own Father, that he and his Father work on the Sabbath, and that he should be honored just as the Father is honored. In the other New Testament Gospels, Jesus claims the authority to forgive sins, a prerogative the Old Testament insists belongs to Yahweh alone. See Psalm 130, verse 8, or Isaiah 43:25. Of course, as we've seen, Jesus is also called God directly by John in John 1:1, 1:18, and by Thomas in 20:28. And yet, when I was studying this topic as a young man, I wondered, but why didn't Jesus just come right out and say the three simple words, I am God? Then no one could deny it. Today, critics of the Trinity insist Jesus never claimed to be God in the full sense, and they say the passages I just cited can be explained in other ways. Could they be right? Even if you think not, we're still faced with the question of why Jesus doesn't just come right out and say the words, I am God, directly and unequivocally. As I've studied this topic in detail for decades, I see in the Gospels that Jesus did forcefully assert his deity in ways that set his Jewish contemporaries back on their heels. And yet, there was a strategy to revealing this ginormously profound reality. In chapter 8 of God the Son, I explain this strategy. In this lesson, we're going to probe the question a bit further and explore why it matters so much. In chapter 8 of my book, I talk about Jesus' absolute I am declarations in John. Many centuries before the birth of Jesus, God appeared to Moses at the burning bush on Mount Sinai. When Moses asked God for his personal name, God replied, I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you. God also said to Moses, say to the Israelites, the Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation. Exodus 3:14 and 15. As we've learned already, when we see Lord in all uppercase letters in the Old Testament, that means the underlying Hebrew word is Yahweh, God's sacred, personal name. But it's also important to know that the first person singular verbal form of the word Yahweh is Ehyeh, translated into English as I am. And so, in this passage, Yahweh is unpacking the meaning of his name as the one who is ever present, the self-existent one, or, as he is often called, the eternal one. Yahweh is I am. When we come to the Gospel of John, many centuries later, we find Jesus declaring, before Abraham was born, I am. John 8:58. Jesus' enemies quickly saw the connection to Exodus 3 and other Old Testament texts in which Yahweh calls himself I am. He was claiming the divine name of Yahweh for himself. We're told, at this, they picked up stones to stone him, but Jesus hid himself, slipping away from the temple grounds. John 8:59. Here, then, is a clear case in which Jesus claims to be Yahweh, even though he doesn't use the precise words, I am God. Even his enemies understood him this way, as we can see from their reaction. Later, when they again wanted to stone him to death, they said to him, we are not stoning you for any good work, but for blasphemy, because you, a mere man, claim to be God. John 10:33. And yet, as clear as Jesus' words may sound to us, and even to his enemies, the idea that Yahweh was living on earth as a man took a while to sink in for his followers. We have no indication from John or any of the other Gospels that from this point on they clearly understood and believed that Jesus was God incarnate. They didn't fall down and worship before him, offer sacrifices to him, or start calling him God. If Jesus clearly claimed to be God, why didn't they seem to get the memo? Perhaps they thought his enemies were twisting his words or misinterpreting them because they hated him. And think about this. When Peter has his big light bulb moment, is it to declare that Jesus is God? No. He calls him the Holy One of God in John 6:69 and the Messiah, the Son of the living God in Matthew 16:16. But nowhere in the Gospels do we see the disciples say, "You are Yahweh himself, God in the flesh." They believed he was the Messiah, but not, apparently, God. Jesus revealed his identity gradually. The Son of Man, the suffering and dying Son of Man, the Son of Man who would rise from the dead, and yes, the Messiah who was the actual, unique Son of God. But all of this was revealed gradually. To try to shift all the gears at once would have been more than the disciples could handle. In each case, it had to be revealed slowly, on Jesus' terms, in bite-sized pieces, so his followers could get it. Think of it. If Jesus started his ministry by proclaiming in the streets, "I am God, worship me," he surely would have been stoned to death, or, at the very least, regarded as completely insane by everyone. He wouldn't have been able to fulfill his ministry of teaching, healing, and proclaiming God's kingdom. For it to work, it had to be a gradual reveal that brought his followers along, step by step, so they could grasp it. It's during the intense debate with his enemies in John 8 that Jesus reveals when the light will finally go on and people will realize and believe in him as the God-man. Jesus said, "When you lift up the Son of Man, then you will realize that I am." John 8:28 in the New American Bible. Being lifted up will flip the switch. This refers to Jesus' death, in which he is lifted up on a cross, and then his resurrection from the grave. And sure enough, after Jesus rises from the dead, the light finally goes on for the disciples. In the climactic declaration of John's Gospel, the doubter turned believer, the doubting Thomas himself, worships Jesus as Yahweh after he sees him alive from the dead. "My Lord and my God," he says to Jesus in John 20:28. After Jesus' resurrection, the disciples finally were able to put the pieces of the puzzle together. What seemed so confusing and even contradictory before his crucifixion, the Messiah dying, impossible. Yahweh a man, inconceivable. Suddenly now all made sense to them. They looked back over Jesus' ministry and put two and two together. It finally added up into the surprise of their lives. But we'll get more into that in our next lesson. Right now, I want to circle back to Jesus' gradual reveal and show how it directly relates to your own life and experience. When you first meet someone, you may know nothing about the person, but if you become friends, you learn more and more about the person as the friendship gradually develops. To really become close, you both have to open up to one another, and that takes a choice on the part of both parties. It also takes time, doesn't it? Even if a person opens up right away, you still have to be around the person to see if what you've heard matches up with how the person behaves in real time, right? When I first met Debbie Rice, I really liked her. We met in the student lounge at college. I was a senior and she was a freshman. My first impression was, wow, she's super. Immediately, I wanted to date her. As we went out a few more times, I kept liking her more and more. I thought she could be the one for me. But she wasn't as easily convinced. Can you blame her? She told me that she just wanted to be friends. But then, as time went on and our friendship developed, she finally started to see the light. Several months later, Debbie Rice became Debbie Ream. Today, I know and love her more than ever. Jesus teaches that for his followers, a similar scenario takes place. It's a gradual reveal. The night before Jesus died, he addressed this topic with his closest followers. Notice the progression in this key verse. The person who has my commandments and obeys them is the one who loves me. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him and reveal myself to him. John 14:21. This passage mystified and fascinated me for years. I always wanted to understand it. Let's look at it carefully, piece by piece. First, Jesus speaks of a person who has his commandments. He owns them. He has Jesus' commands. He takes them as his own values in his life. But he also obeys Jesus' commands. This person doesn't just talk the talk. He walks the walk. Jesus says this is the person who really loves him. What commandments might Jesus have in mind here? All of his teachings would qualify. But the commandment he mentions repeatedly that night is for us to love one another the same way Jesus loved us, showing God's love in practical, humble, self-sacrificial ways, as Jesus did. Earlier that evening, Jesus showed his love by washing his disciples' feet, the duty of the lowest servant. The next day, he would die on the cross in our place for our sins to pay the penalty we deserve to pay. Through tangible acts of kindness towards others, we follow Jesus' example and obey his command. According to Jesus, this leads to an incredible experience. Notice Jesus' startling words. The one who loves me will be loved by my Father, and I will love him. You say, wait a minute. I thought God already loves everyone. But here it sounds as though the Father and the Son will love me only if I first love him and obey Jesus' commandments. It does sound like that, doesn't it? But it really can't be the case. Elsewhere in John, it says, "For God so loved the world that he gave his one and only Son," John 3:16. Here, God loves the whole world before he sends his Son. John writes, "We love because he first loved us." 1 John 4:19. So what gives here? Is this a contradiction? No. I think what Jesus is getting at in John 14:21 is that when you express genuine love for Jesus by obeying his commands, you experience God's love in a way you would not otherwise. We see the same thing in our relationships. Let's say a mother loves her daughter, but her daughter does not respond by loving her back. To this daughter, her mother's love is like water falling on a stone. It bounces off. But if the daughter opens up and begins to love her mother, she becomes like a sponge. The water falls on it, soaks it up, and becomes saturated with it. To her, it may seem like her mother just started loving her. but she resented her mother's affection in the past. Now she receives it and consequently experiences it. Likewise, in John 14:21, Jesus is talking from our perspective in experiencing God's love. Love that you never felt before all of a sudden seems to flow into you from Jesus and the Father. According to Jesus, you begin to experience this when you really own Jesus' commandments. You've taken them into yourself, and they are now your code of conduct, your way of life. You do this not just because you know it's right, but because you really and truly love Jesus. You're not obeying to earn something, but just because you're crazy about Jesus and you want to please him. Then you begin to experience God's love deeply. But then comes another surprise. Jesus goes on to say, I will love him and will reveal myself to him. Reveal myself. Amazing. It's when I begin to love Jesus and experience his love that he reveals himself to me. He shows himself to me. How so? What's it like? Well, first, this must be talking about a person who's already a believer, perhaps for some time, because you already have started obeying his commands, soaking up his love, and now, as a consequence, Jesus reveals himself to you. What could this mean? Biblical scholars have puzzled over this statement. Is Jesus talking about showing himself to his disciples after he rises from the dead? Or is he referring to seeing him after death or at his second coming? Jesus doesn't seem to be talking about any of those things, at least not primarily. Jesus' emphasis is on the individual, not a group of his followers or all believers at the second coming. He uses the word him, meaning an individual, whether male or female. Somehow, Jesus reveals himself to you in a personal, individualized way, and it increases your love and deepens your relationship with him. Is this happening in your life? If not, don't be discouraged. Claim the promise of John 14:21. Own his commands and obey his commands. Then expect to experience God's love in a new and deeper way. As a result, you can expect Jesus to reveal himself to you. I could share some of my experiences, but now it's time for you to talk. Thanks for watching. God bless.